All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Essery. I'm an associate professor at Wake Forest University. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. The IMC is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Wake Forest University and previously sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. Excuse me. The IMC is affiliated with the Society for Political Methodology, who hopes that you will support quantitative research in political science by joining. The membership fee is just $10 a year for graduate students. I will post a link to join the society in the Zoom webinar chat window after this introduction. This week's speaker is Amanda Bittner, professor at Memorial University of Newfoundland. Her talk is entitled Gender Conformity and Recognition, Self-Perceptions, Peer Perceptions, and Political Attitudes. And of course, this is joint work with Elizabeth Goodyear Grant. Amanda's talk will last between 30 and 40 minutes, after which point we'll take questions from the audience. You may ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. And you can ask questions at any time, but we will hold all the questions till the end of the presentation. A link to Amanda's paper and slideshow will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you may refer to it throughout the presentation, and I will post those links right after we get started. And now I'd like to welcome Amanda Bittner to the IMC. Welcome.
Hi there. Thanks so much for having me. Okay, so this talk today is a work in progress, and I'm super excited about the opportunity to get feedback. So the more feedback and questions, the better, so don't feel shy about that. This work is part of a larger project that I'm working on with my colleague Elizabeth Goodyear Grant, and it ultimately is trying to think about the way that we measure gender, conceptualize gender, and in particular ask questions about respondents' gender in survey research. So I'm going to kind of walk through this project, but as I mentioned, it's part of a larger project, and the different kind of components do fit together, so we can talk about those other projects as well if you like. So first of all, the kind of root motivation for this project is this idea that sex and gender are not actually the same thing, and that a lot of survey research treats the two, at least when the concepts are operationalized, as being interchangeable, and we think this is problematic. So if we think about the way that the concept of gender is measured in surveys, we're actually asking a question about sex most of the time. And we're often, especially if it's a telephone survey, not even asking the individual to tell us what their sex is. And then we go ahead and call it gender. So we think that this is a problematic thing in and of itself, but that it also may give us less information than we could get if we were to actually measure gender as gender. So this is kind of our larger project. And we're not doing this alone, and there's lots of other folks who have begun to do this work as well, and so it's part of a larger conversation that we're trying to have right now. So we also think that in addition to the idea that sex and gender are not the same thing and that we can't treat them the same way, we've got to recognize the fact that there are multiple dimensions of gender. So we can think about gender identity, we can think about gender salience, so the extent to which your gender is important to you, we can think about your gender expression as well as your gender ideology. So this paper that I'm going to present today is trying to look at that question of identity, but more so to talk about expression. So we want to look at the way that gender expression plays a role in political attitudes and the way that individuals interact with the world and so on. So the question that we're kind of asking and that motivates this research is to what extent our experience with outward expressions of gender nonconformity may affect our political attitudes. So I want to note kind of two main things here. First of all, we measure outward expressions of gender nonconformity as what we call a mismatch between the way that respondents conceive of their own gender and the way that they predict that others might conceive of their gender as well, or how it's read by others. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we go on, but that's sort of the first thing I wanted to point out. On this issue of the proposition, so we think that it is possible that our experience with our outward expressions of gender nonconformity may lead to more liberal attitudes for individuals who perhaps are not conforming to traditional stereotypical norms, because those individuals may have experience with discrimination, exclusion, marginalization, and that this may lead them to being more receptive or more open to kind of liberalized perspectives on this. We don't actually know for certain why this might be. The literature leads us into this direction, but we think that it's possible that this experience of living a kind of non-conforming lifestyle, and there's gradations of that, and we can talk about that as well, may actually sensitize individuals to these issues and encourage these more liberal positions. It's important to note, though, that we don't test that mechanism, and we think that's something to think about in the future. But the literature has led us in this direction. So let's talk a little bit about why this question. Gender performance, or the way that we interact in the world, has a major impact on how others perceive us. And we can consider the fact, and I think that we've all experienced this to some extent, seen it at least, if not experiencing it personally, that backlash can result for those whose outward expression is interpreted as kind of out of line with the normative gender expression for the perceived sex of the individual. And so I think that, especially in contemporary society, we're more aware of this than we used to be, let's say, 50 years ago, but this has been an ongoing thing. It's the case that the political science literature does talk about the outward gender expression of individuals, but usually in relation to elites. So thinking about candidates, legislators, executives, and so on. And then we look at how that might affect voters' attitudes, as well as media coverage of those candidates. But not a lot of work has been done, at least in political science, about kind of everyday gender expression. So us as regular people, and how we think about the political world, and how that is linked to the way that we express ourselves and experience the kind of world around us. So again, I want to mention, so we're talking about, this experience of kind of social backlash, that because we perhaps are gender nonconforming, that backlash may create empathy for others. So this might be both generalized empathy for those who are facing discrimination, or specific empathy for those who are also kind of read as gender nonconforming. We also believe that it's potentially going to be symmetrical for women and men, in that both women and men can have non-normative gender expression that may have that same impact of resulting in kind of ostracization. So we would expect we expect to see effects for both women and men in the study, and for both women and men, we think that will result in more liberal attitudes on issues of discrimination, marginalization, or exclusion. And again, I want to note that we don't test this mechanism of empathy in this study, but the literature suggests this is the most likely route to more liberalized attitudes. And literature demonstrates, too, that greater empathy does tend to result from personal experiences with discrimination. So, for example, there are some findings in some of the research on gender and political behavior that show that women as a group are more attuned to and more progressive on these issues due to a greater emphasis on communal traits and care for others, which is what social role theory would predict, as well as that kind of shared experience of marginalization. So, for example, Maxwell 2015 finds that American women are less likely to hold racist attitudes than men, in part because of their own kind of firsthand experience with discrimination. So let me kind of walk through this particular study in a bit more detail, and I look forward to your feedback, because again, it's kind of a work in progress, and it's definitely not perfect. So what we did is we piloted 3 questions on a series of provincial election studies that took place between 2010 and 2012. So these were during Canadian provincial elections. There were 6 of them in total. So we asked 3 questions that have been asked in some variations over the years, usually in kind of psychology research, sociology research, and so on, less in political science. So the first question, we were asking individuals to say what their gender was, and think of it as a continuum. So where on this scale of 0 to 100, where one side is masculine and one side is feminine, where would you place yourself on this scale? So that's question number 1. Question number 2 mirrored the same scale, and then asked individuals, okay, now where would others place you on this same continuum? And then the third question we asked was, how closely do you identify with your gender group? Again, on a scale, asking them to identify the extent to which they have a strong identification or a weak identification with their gender group, whatever the group may be. So this work that we're going to present today is going to focus on, in particular, question number 2, the way that others perceive us, but it also uses parts of questions 1 and 3. And we've published some of the work we've been doing on this general topic. A paper in political behavior was published in 2017 that focused on the first question about where we place ourselves on that scale, and then a paper in the Canadian Journal of Political Science in also 2017 that looked at that salience question, the third question. So I want to point out again, so we're saying that the way that others perceive us, we're calling that a proxy for gender self-expression. Now, obviously, conceptually, this is highly imperfect, and I take a lot of suggestion on this as to what we might do to ask. What might we ask that would better measure the perceptions of others and sort of our gender self-expression? We do think that this is a pretty good proxy for the way that we as individuals navigate the world around us. So the goal for this project is to look at the extent to which the kind of self-identity, that first question, where do you place yourself on the scale, matches the peer perception scale, so the way that others perceive us and where they would place us on that scale. We want to look at the extent to which, if there's a mismatch between these two things, does that influence political attitudes? Okay, so that's kind of our ultimate goal with this question. And we think that experiences with gender nonconformity will have a liberalizing effect on political attitudes based on the literature, and on a certain level based on kind of an intuitive kind of common sense. We think that makes sense. But we understand and we're really kind of very hyper conscious of the fact that gender nonconformity is not just a mismatch. And so we want to talk about and tease that apart a little bit more too. So in terms of the peer perception variable, I showed you the question itself. We're asking respondents to estimate how others perceive their gender on that 0 to 100 scale, where one side is masculine, one side is feminine, and we have those that same scale for self-perceptions. And we're treating this question and the kind of comparison between these two questions as a proxy for conformity to, or deviation from, normative gender expression. So we're operationalizing nonconformity as this mismatch between these two variables. So we sort of see it as being kind of two possible configurations. Individuals place themselves on one side of the scale, masculine or feminine, while peer perception is on the other. So you identify as a feminine leading person, so me, for example, and others would see me as masculine leaning on the opposite side of the scale. So we see that as being kind of a full mismatch. And we can talk about the terminology too, which is imperfect. And then the other possible mismatch that we kind of think about is when self and peer placement are on the same side of the scale, but with scars that vary. So, you place yourself as 100% feminine and somebody places you as, 75% feminine, something like that, or vice versa on the masculine side. So we see those as two things. So you're still being seen as feminine by others, but not as feminine as you see yourself, or vice versa. So that's kind of what we're thinking. So again, I keep giving this caveat over and over again, and maybe that's a bad sales job, but I want to really note that peer perception variable, we're thinking about it as a proxy for gender expression, and absent kind of a direct measure of gender expression, which we think would be really challenging to derive, we think this is a pretty good proxy. So in the paper, what we do is we kind of go through in 3 steps. First of all, we want to look at the relationship between self-perceptions or gender self-identity and outward expression, or those peer perceptions, number 1. Secondly, we want to look at the extent to which, who is it that's being misread versus not misread by others. So we want to look at that as well. And then finally, we look at the extent to which gender nonconformity, or that mismatch, has an impact on political attitudes. So we put special emphasis on political attitudes linked to discrimination, marginalization, but we do look at a full set of economic and social and political issues. So I'm going to focus mostly on that third bullet point in this presentation, but I'm going to start with a little bit of discussion of points 1 and 2, just to kind of give you a sense of what we saw in the data. So first of all, what you can see here, we're plotting the first question, gender self-placement, against the way others perceive us. And what you can kind of see here is that most of the time, where we place ourselves and where others place us matches in the broad sense. And yet, at the same time, in other cases, it doesn't. So it's just a basic, plotting the 2 variables against one another. When we divide this up and look at it by sex, we can see that this is still broadly true, right? And at the same time, it varies a little bit. So the correlation coefficient for men is 0.79. For women, it's 0.84. So this indicates that there's greater correspondence between self and peer placement for women than there is for men. So we think that's interesting and worth thinking about as well. But for approximately 2/3 of our sample, 67% of women and 65% of men, there's no difference between where respondents place themselves on that 0 to 100 scale and where they think that others would place them. Not even 1 one dot, like no difference. So we think that, so most people feel like their outward gender expression matches the way they feel on the inside. And for the rest, the gap between self and peer placement is really not that large for the most part. The average is about 2 points. So 3 points for women and 1 point for men, with a standard deviation of nearly 23 points for on average, 16 for men and 29 for women. So there's a larger variance for women, but for most people, their ideas about kind of the way that they present themselves match with the way that they feel on the inside. So I want to show you a table now, and what this is going to show you is just sort of a different view of how respondents place themselves on that scale and where they thought that others might place them. So what we did is we divided that 0 to 100 scale into 3 sections for this paper. So those who place themselves on the masculine side, so numbers are 0 to 49, but numbers themselves don't really matter that much. Those who place themselves right smack in the middle at the 50, and then those who place themselves on the feminine side between 51 and 100. And what we can see here is that most men, did I move that? There we go. Most men place themselves in the most masculine box and believe that others would place them there too. And similarly, most women, look in the bottom right-hand quadrant there, place themselves in the feminine box and think that others would also see them there. Among men, 98% of them self-identified on the masculine end of the scale between 0 and 49, and most felt that others would put them there too. There were about 36 men that felt that others would place them on the feminine side of the scale, and 14 placed themselves there too. So that was a match. They felt where they were, others also would place them. And another 93 men placed themselves in the middle, and 58 of those men felt that others would put them there too, while 27 felt that they would see them as more masculine, and 8 others more feminine. So in other words, for men whose gender identity is less traditional or less prescriptive, shall we say, and lies somewhere outside of the most masculine option on the gender scale, gender expression is anticipated to be less accurately or readily perceived by their peers. The men that regard themselves as highly masculine, they see their outward gender expression as matching that traditional norm. And that's not really, to be honest, all that surprising if we think about, the world around us. So for some men, this will no doubt represent an accurate match between their gender identity and their expression, while for other men, this apparent match will be more kind of aspirational projected as a result of the strong value placed on masculinity in social and political life, right? So for both women and men, our norm is the patriarchy, our norm and our standard is masculine traits. And so it's easier, I think, for women also to present masculine traits than it is for men to present feminine traits. So among women, 82% self-identified on the feminine side of the scale, and of those, the majority, so about 97%, thought others would place them there too. Women are more likely than men to self-identify in the middle or on the side of the scale that does not match their sex. We can see here that there's 273 women, just over here, that suggest that others would see them on the masculine side of the scale, and of those, 85% also place themselves on that end of the continuum. So again, similarly to the male respondents, when women self-identified outside the feminine pole of the spectrum, they reported that their gender expression would be less readily matched to their gender identity by peers. So, these are some interesting results in a sense, because we're seeing that there is variation. We're seeing that there is variance across these different categories of self-identity and where we think others might place us. But at the same time, most of us match our kind of gender prescribed norm with relation to kind of sex. So these prescribed patterns are about total matching or mismatching on the feminine masculine scale, rather than about degrees of matching. And so, a large majority of both women and men whose gender conform to the traditional sex category, so women seeing themselves on the feminine side of the scale and men on the masculine side of the scale, felt that others would put them in the same kind of broad space. Among nonconformers, so for individuals who place themselves directly in the middle of the scale or on the side of the scale that does not conform to the traditional sex variable, so men who saw themselves in the middle or on the feminine side, women who saw themselves in the middle or on the masculine side, 28% of women and 33% of men felt that others' perceptions would not match their gender identity. So if you are a nonconformer in terms of your the relationship between your sex and your gender, you don't believe that others see you the way you see yourself. At the same time, it's important to note that this total mismatch is not the most common situation for those whose gender identity and peer placement are not identical. So for the majority of people, a partial mismatch, and again, this terminology is really I'm not comfortable with it, but I'm not sure what the better term would be in this case. So if you have suggestions, please give them. But this partial mismatch is much more common and arises in two ways. One, the respondent identifies as slightly more feminine or more masculine than how they think others would perceive their gender. Or secondly, the respondent identifies as slightly less masculine or feminine than how they think others perceive their gender. But in both of those cases, respondents and peers place the respondents on the same side of that masculine-feminine gender scale. And again, the average mismatch is only about 2 points, with a bit more variance for women than it is for men. So in terms of who gets mismatched or who is perceived as gender nonconforming, there weren't a lot of clear patterns, to be honest, but we did identify some. So women in the highest income quartile were likely to experience a partial mismatch whereby they believe their expression is more masculine than their inward identity, which again is not that surprising, as research demonstrates that highly successful women are often perceived to be more masculine than the average woman, or they believe that they must behave or perform in a way that is more masculine than how they might feel they really are. So we think it makes sense. And we describe other patterns in the paper, but for the most part, we don't think it's super exciting, that part. In terms of the impact of mismatch on attitudes, we think this is more interesting, and we want to focus on this more in this presentation, but also we want to kind of focus on this more going forward. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time today, which is not that large, talking about this one graphic that I'm going to show to you here. So this graphic displays the marginal effects of the two variables of interest, so this total mismatch variable and this partial mismatch variable, on political attitudes. So we have other standard controls in here accounting for other known, although unrelated, drivers of attitudes on these issues. I'm not going to go into the controls. The paper, it's available online. You're welcome to read it and send me feedback. And if it's terrible, I will listen to it. But what we see is that what kind of emerges most clearly for these issues is that those individuals who felt that there was a total mismatch between their gender self-placement and their peer placement tended to hold more progressive attitudes on these various political issues than did those the partial mismatch or the reference group, which is a complete match between self and peer perceptions. So I want to focus on the partial mismatchers, again, bad word, that are symbolized here by the kind of the gray diamond shape and underlined in this glittery, fabulous underlining tool that I used that day. So I want you to recall that we're talking about partial mismatchers who are those individuals who felt that others would place them on the same quadrant or same part of the scale as they would place themselves, but who felt that the specific number on that 0 to 100 scale might vary a bit. So like, again, the average is 2 points. We're talking about a lot, with a standard deviation of 16 for men and 29 for women. So in most cases, a partial mismatch between self and peer perceptions did not have a statistically significant effect on political attitudes. But we do see effects for both total and partial mismatch on this direct question about discrimination in hiring. This is the one that's underlined here. So the question asked, do you strongly agree, somewhat disagree, or strongly disagree with each of the following statements? And then there were a whole bunch, and the statement is, discrimination makes it difficult for women to get jobs equal to their abilities. So what the data are showing us here is that those whose gender expression is non-conforming in some way, these kind of partial mismatchers, are more likely to agree. And we think this is perhaps because they have personally experienced discrimination in hiring, quite plausible, as a result of their gender identity or expression, or because they are more empathetic to the larger effects of structural discrimination on marginalized others, whether on account of sex, gender, race, ability, and so on. So not a lot of effects, right? So we have that one variable that showed that there was an impact there for these partial mismatchers. What we can see on this next slide here is that the dynamics for the kind of total mismatch, and again, I want to really flag that the terminology isn't perfect. That this is much more noticeable. So for those who report a total mismatch between their gender identity and their gender expression as measured by their sense of peer perceptions, these individuals tend to have more liberal views on several other issues. So for example, on the political underrepresentation of women, those with the total mismatch are more likely to agree with the statement that it is a serious problem that there are many more men than women in the House of Commons. This is the Canadian legislature. So what we think this demonstrates is a sensitivity to questions of representation, and that it may also indicate empathy with the women aspirants and candidates who have attempted to get elected. We likewise see greater agreement among the total mismatched respondents on support for same-sex marriage, which has long been an equality issue for same-sex couples. And we see stronger support for welfare spending among those whose gender identity, self-identity doesn't match their expression. So in sum, on a whole host of discrimination-based issues, marriage equality, women's representation in legislatures, hiring discrimination, and more, we're seeing liberalized attitudes among those who've experienced non-conforming gender expression, and likely forms of backlash or alienation on account of that experience of non-conforming gender expression. So the literature suggests that backlash against gender non-conformity starts very early, like in the schools, children, teachers, parents, all that kind of stuff. And so, that this would have an impact on political attitudes is maybe not that shocking. And we think that there's something here, even though we think that it needs more work. These results that we're presenting here are really only a first step. But we do think that there's evidence here to support the idea that nonconformity, or at least experiences with being misgendered, does lead to more liberal attitudes on issues related to discrimination and exclusion. But we recognize that there's still lots of work to be done. So we'd like to think that what we're doing is, I think Elizabeth agrees with me, is adding to the conversation in hopes that somebody else will help us figure this out. We think we need to sort out how to best test the mechanism at work. So is what's happening here generalized empathy? Is it about personal experience? Is it about group consciousness? Is it something else? We don't really know. We have some ideas about this, but we need to actually kind of look at that in more depth. And I think it's important that we think about how to actually measure these separate mechanisms. How can we actually operationalize this in surveys? And that is our ultimate goal. I think conceptually, though, too, it's really important that we need to think about the connection between mismatch and this kind of overarching concept that we're trying to get at of gender nonconformity. So we think that our measure of mismatch is a pretty decent proxy for gender nonconformity, but it's not perfect, and we need to do some more work to think about that a little bit more. So this is very much a work in progress, and we would really love to get your input and feedback on this project. Like email, Twitter, whatever, we'll take it. We're very grateful. I think, what's the term I'm supposed to say? You can slide into my DMs, or my DMs are open. Like, go for it. I'll take all the help I can get. Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to comment on sliding into Amanda's DMs.
Did I use that wrong? Is that like when I use Netflix and chill wrong?
I would say there's a possibility, but
classic.
Let's leave that where it is. But I would like to thank you for the presentation, and I would also like to say that at this point, Amanda is available to take questions from the audience. And that you can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. And there's already a question in the queue, but I'm going to exercise my moderator's prerogative and ask the first one, which I think it's a little bit, it's definitely a bigger question than the research is trying to address, but I think it's kind of an important predicate question to at least have a sense of what you think about it. What does it mean to be a man or a woman?
Jesus.
What does it mean to be masculine? Because I was thinking about how I would answer that question myself.
Yeah.
Like if you asked me, how do I present or whatever, how do others perceive me, and how do I perceive myself? And the initial thing I thought was, well, do you mean wearing lipstick? Do you mean long? What does that mean? And so I'm wondering, first of all, what you think, and secondly, how you think the respondents reacted to that question.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. And I think that's one that has really guided a lot of our research. So a lot of the early stuff we did, so with that first question, where would you place yourself on this continuum, which you're right, is extremely difficult to answer. And we suspect that where individuals answer will vary by context, right? So that's one thing that I would say, one kind of caveat. What Elizabeth and I did, and we're still working on, we've got a paper under review right now from this, we did a series of focus groups across the country and Canada here, where we got people together to kind of talk about gender and their experiences of what their gender was and how they felt about it and when they thought about it and stuff, because a lot of us don't think about our gender, we just kind of exist and do our thing, right? And so, what we've found through these focus groups is that gender is highly contextualized and is based a the focus group that had, that was highly religious, senior women, was very different from the focus group that we had that was mixed gender, young people, or LGBTQ plus groups. And so like there's very different experiences of gender. The main ways that folks tend to talk about their gender and their experience with gender in kind of everyday life is through the household. So they experience that a lot in their marriage, in taking care of children if they have them, and so on. So that's one thing. A lot in the workplace. People are very, especially women, are very conscious of their gender in the workplace, and talked about that a lot. Gender in sports, gender in marketing, so political ads, but also kind of even just, tampon ads, right? So these are all highly gendered and make you think about your gender on a regular basis. But I mean, so my favorite, I'll tell you this little short story. My favorite focus group was one here in St. John's, Newfoundland. It was one of the first ones we did. And it was a mixed group of people between the ages of about 20 and let's say 40. So it was mixed sex group. And so we went through and give the people stimuli, what do you think about this picture? What does this make you think of? How do you experience your gender on a regular basis? And there was this one guy in this focus group, and he was a really, he was what we call a bayman here in Newfoundland. So I guess the other kind of equivalent would be, presenting as kind of rednecky. So, beanie, big giant beard, plaid shirt, likes to go skidooing. I don't know, this is Canadian, right? So those are the kind of features of this bayman, as opposed to an urban kind of metrosexual type of person. And so he's coming out as a self-described bayman. And he called himself a dirty, dirty bayman. Like he really was embracing this identity, right? So he thought about his gender, right? And so he's telling us all this, and then he looks at this line, this continually, after I've asked him, can you place yourself somewhere on this line? And he says, I gotta say, I'm doing my accent right now, and I shouldn't do that. I gotta say, for a straight line, it's awfully tangly. And I thought this was the best way to describe, how difficult it is to place yourself on this continuum, right? So he then explained further, and he said, look at me, I'm a dirty, dirty bayman. I wear plaid, I go skidooing, I got this giant beard, I like to go hunting. He's like, but I like to take long baths. My girlfriend has to catch all the spiders, and I love the beard oil. And so he kind of described this, like, not dichotomy, but the fact that it's very complex, right? So I think, so my answer to you, honestly, Justin, is I don't know. What your gender is to you is different probably from what it is to me and how we experience it and so on. And this kind of speaks to that question of how difficult it is to measure this, right? Because, what our research has found so far is that for about 70% of the sample, the sex question is just fine, right? Because we're socialized that way. So of course it's just fine. But for about 30% of the sample, we can get more information when we ask this gender question instead of just the sex question. So we're kind of trying to push into that direction. But I don't know that I think that this continuum is the perfect question. Is it unidimensional, or can you be 100% masculine and 100% feminine simultaneously? Like maybe that's something to think about. And so we're in the middle of piloting a series of questions right now and trying to calibrate them and so on. But honestly, frankly, I find this project terrifying because it feels very challenging to conceptualize and measure. This is not easy, despite the fact that we all have a gender and it affects us all the time, and that's for both women and men.
Yeah, the reason I was thinking about this was because, of course, like everyone else who studies gender, I assume that there's a concept that underlies the measure, and it's very powerful, for example, in explaining attitudes toward corruption or attitudes toward risk aversion. It's very effective. There's a strong correlation between them and even some causal relationships. But when you really start to pick it apart, it becomes pretty clear to me that we're not... the concept is it's too much like Potter Stewart and pornography, right? I know it when I see it, which is like a terrible definition.
But see, this fits with the slide of my DMs that you've just done, so that well done.
Right. So I think it might be, if you're interested in gender nonconformity, what I was thinking about was it might be better if that is the target, to just ask people how much they feel they conform with their gender.
Yep.
Because then you can sort of sidestep the question of whatever it is, and just get right at how much they feel they're conforming or not conforming.
Yeah.
But that, I think there is this larger question looming, and I'm certainly interested to see what you can uncover about that.
Yeah, me too. So what I would say too about this question about nonconformity and what this means and so on is, I think that I mean, there's a large literature in psychology that looks at, how we measure gender and how we conceptualize gender. And the challenge with that literature is that there are these massive scales, so like a 60-item battery. So, and then from that, we compose this, kind of objective measure of gender. And we just don't believe that our colleagues will ever do this on a regular basis. And so our goal is to create 2 to 3 questions that can be used routinely and that actually is gender, or as close as we can get to that as possible, as opposed to relying upon these 60-item batteries that are solid and work well and have still been, demonstrated to work now and are effective. But I mean, there's no way that my colleagues who are doing forecasting models and incorporating public opinion are going to care about that and do it. And so, but they might agree to, 2 questions or 3 questions, and that will allow the rest of us to care about gender in a way that is actually gender.
Well, and more than that, we just don't have time.
Absolutely.
I've only got so much time on the CCES or whatever, so I can't
100%. Yeah.
So I want to come to some of the audience questions now. So an anonymous attendee asks, why create a 100-point scale if the categories of self-identification you assign completely remove variation in the middle category, which is 50? Would a 10-point scale or a 5-point Likert scale work just as well?
Maybe. So like I said, we were piloting these questions on this series of provincial election studies where, in actual fact, the goal of those studies was to look at the role of leaders in elections, which is kind of the other kind of work that I do. So we were trying these out to see what would happen and to see if we can get any nuance over the sex question. But I see no reason why we couldn't use a different measure, and I see no reason why we couldn't compress the scale. So potentially, yeah.
All right. Jane Sumner asks, do you have any thoughts about how this might interact with race? And I assume by this, she means either this project or this measurement problem.
Yeah, great question, Jane. Thank you. So the focus group paper that I was talking about a minute ago, we did find that experiences of gender or perceptions of gender really we don't think anymore, well, we should have known this before, but, we're white people, that we can look at this in a non-intersectional way. So the focus groups that we did across the country, we did do some single-raced focus groups. We did do some groups with LGBTQ plus groups. And so we found that in these different contexts with these different experiences, individuals talked about, their gender in different kinds of ways. So, for example, the LGBTQ plus group, a lot of the people in those groups talked about how they didn't experience, or they weren't gender wasn't salient for them in their relationships and the way that it was, or in the house at home, in the way that it was for heterosexual couples, for example. So they talked about, we're a same-sex couple, we do things based on our aptitude and our interests as opposed to traditional gender norms because we are of the same gender. And so this was something that we thought, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Of course that makes sense. And then individuals, we had one group of South Asian descent Canadians, and these individuals talked a lot about kind of the role of tradition, the role of religion, and the way that gendered values from the past had been passed down, and so how their gender as brown men could be different now than the gender of their parents and the way that their parents parented them. So one guy talked about how his dad was visiting from India and was, hanging out, and he was saying, this is awesome. You are taking care of your kids. You are getting to love your kids in this way. I never got to do that, and I wish I had. And so sort of lamenting, so this is almost like a multi-generational racial kind of intersection on a certain level, where we can kind of tease apart some of this. And so we think that absolutely individuals' experiences with their gender and of what that kind of nonconformity means will definitely vary by race, by ethnicity, by sex certainly, but also by age and all kinds of things. And so this is, I think, for me, part of the thing that concerns me a lot is that we need to think about this concept as being highly contextual, and therefore it's going to have to change over time. And so can we find a measure now that has some staying power and that accounts for some of this stuff? Or will we have to do this project again every 20 years as gender shifts and as people shift and as the times change? And so, and I don't know the answer to that. But I mean, yeah.
Well, one thing I'm wondering is so for example, there are people who are relatively low in most forms of gendered expression, In other words, you could say they're neither strongly masculine nor feminine. And then there are perhaps a small number of people who have strong expression in both dimensions. And then, of course, two major groups. I'm wondering if these are differences in, along a scale, or if there are differences in kind. And what I mean by that is, so for example, is a trans man or a trans woman similar to, is like a trans woman similar to a man who has some feminine traits, or is there something dramatically different that puts you in a completely different category? And what I'm thinking about is, like, on that scale, is it just a sort of, well, I get to a certain point in the scale and I become a trans person, or is like, oh, no, wait a minute, there's something else completely different going on here. Like, you can be a very feminine man and still be a man, or you can be a trans woman, right? Those are two different things.
Yeah, so I feel like you've answered your own question, although I don't know that I actually have an answer. I mean, I'm not a trans woman, so I don't know what that experience is like. But I mean, this paper was under review recently, and this is one of the questions one of the reviewers asked was, to talk about this kind of, because we do talk about trans-identified individuals and what that experience is like, at least in terms of literature and what we know about their navigation of the political world and discrimination and marginalization and so on. But this is, again, one of those things where, so one could imagine where, there are also differences in terms of the way individuals pass as whatever they feel that they are, right? So conceptually, at least on this scale, if you are like me, so you put yourself on the feminine side of the scale, and I think I'm pretty girly, so I think others would place me there too, even if it's not a perfect match. I might be at the exact same spot as a trans woman who feels that she is being accurately gendered, right? So, and that, to me, on a certain, makes total sense, right? Because we are both women, and we identify as women, and we pass as women, and so our experience should be as women. Whereas a person who is being misgendered by their peers is experiencing the world in a very different way. So a trans woman who doesn't easily pass, and therefore has to deal with all kinds of horrible hate crimes, people calling it out, people harassing her in the bathroom, all kinds of stuff. That's a very different experience than my experience, even though, of course, I also experience sexual harassment, all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, I don't have the answer to that question. And that's, again, this is part of what makes this research so scary as a researcher.
Yeah, there's always a chance you'll end up saying something and become infamous. So we have another question from the audience. Do you think perhaps you could get at the mechanisms by A, breaking up the perception question, for example, how you think you're perceived by your parents at work, in public, etc., and B, asking people how they feel about those perceptions?
Okay, I'm just thinking about this for a second here. So asking about how different, so fair, because how I operate at work is different than how I operate in the household versus how I operate with my family and so on, sure. I think that, yes. And that fits with this idea that context matters a lot, and that we ought to think about the way that, because we are performing, right? And so we perform for different audiences. And so this is not that eloquent, because I'm still just thinking about this for a second here. So if we think that we are gender conforming in the workplace because we have to, so we project a particular kind of image that matches the way that we, think of ourselves in terms of gender. Is that the same experience in the world where you're not being perhaps discriminated against, at least not for nonconformity, as somebody who in the household, I don't know, but these are great questions. In terms of the second question about how we could ask how that mismatch or how those perceptions make us feel, I hope whoever this person is, anonymous or otherwise, sends me a message.
It's Jane.
It's Jane. Oh, thank God, Jane, I love you. So yeah, give me some suggestions, because I think that's a really good question.
Okay, a question from Michelle Dion. I'm curious about intersection with age, in part because I find that younger people seem much more comfortable with non-binary or non-conforming identities.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. I mean, Michelle, I'm sure you've seen this in the classroom too, where the way that we talk about gender now compared to even 10 years ago is totally different. And that, watching individuals who are very different in my classroom interact is much more accepting and open and kind than, again, even 10 years ago, which is not that long a period of time. So what we found was that those who are older tend to have more traditional ideas about gender and tend to be more conforming. And so, those individuals experience their gender really closely associated to their sex. So women identify as feminine, men identify as masculine, and most of those people think that others place them there too, with the exception, as I mentioned, of those women who are in the highest income bracket who feel a little bit of nonconformity in the way that they perceive themselves versus how others perceive them, which, as I mentioned, my theory is that it's about having to portray a certain kind, or being in a certain way as a highly successful person. Others will see you as something regardless of whether that's how you feel. So I might feel super feminine all the time, but people think I'm a total, I'm not even gonna say the words, although I'm tempted, and I can see Justin grinning, so I'll stop.
Just remember, this is going up on YouTube.
I'm okay with that.
Okay, so I'll ask one last question. So when this project, and it sounds like this is not just a paper, but sort of an ongoing series of things which could become a book or a series of papers and a project. When this sort of completes, in so much that any agenda ever completes, for those of us who are not, I mean, I don't consider myself a scholar of gender, but I am studying the aspects of gender and how they interact with other things like corruption. What are we, like, what do you want us to be able to do? Like, how should we be thinking about our problems differently?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess for Elizabeth and I, our goals when we set out with this project were largely twofold. One of them is to figure out, okay, if we measure gender as opposed to taking the proxy of sex, is there more information, or is sex good enough? So that's question number one, which we think we have maybe sort of come close to starting to answer, but we're still not positive about that. And we do think that, a 70% match between gender and sex is not terrible. It's just not great, but it does capture a lot. But there's more that can be captured, and we think that that's worth talking about, especially if what you care about is the impact of gender on political attitudes on something, whether it's corruption or something else. So if you, for example, Justin, wanted to talk about, corruption and gender, it doesn't make sense from my perspective for you to talk about it in terms of sex, because there is a measure of gender that you could use that would give you more information and more nuance, which I think as a rigorous researcher you would want to have. So that's number one. Number two, I think that our goal is to come up with 2 to 3 questions that can become the standard, at least for a while, so that, for the next 20 years, we ask questions on surveys that actually get at gender, to allow for, scholars who maybe don't focus on gender all the time to have an appropriate measure of gender in their models so that they're properly controlling for gender as gender, but then also to allow for scholars who want to focus on the impact of gender and want to look at the gender gap in attitudes to be able to actually, again, ask gender as gender. And so we think that, gender is multifaceted and, identity, expression, salience, all that kind of stuff. And so I think once we start to unpack these things and tease them apart, we can get a better sense of the role of gender in society and political attitudes, and that this is worthwhile for all researchers, whether or not your focus is specifically, motivated by an interest in gender.
Oh, wait a minute. One more question. I was about to call it. Jane actually asked another question. I've taken to giving people a text box to self-identify their genders on surveys. Why shouldn't I do this, or what am I missing here? Am I making my life harder than it has to be? Hi, it's Gene again. I actually would say, as a addendum to this, what I've started doing is, instead of saying sex, male, female, right, which is like the standard, from the 50s or whatever, I'll say, first of all, gender, not sex, and then I'll say male, female, or I think other is my category, just giving some other option.
Great question. So I wonder. I feel like I've talked about this topic multiple times with various groups, and maybe including Jane, but maybe not, because I think this is a great question. And yes, so in many ways, text box allows individuals to self-identify as whatever they want, right? And so if you are, gender queer, whatever you want to, whatever your thing is, and who am I to decide what that is for you? You can put it in. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that just in your version of male, female. Or, is that sex, or is that gender? Is it man, woman? Is it masculine, feminine? What are the categories we're giving them? And then having other. So some of the research that I've done with some others suggests that other box leads to all kinds of weird stuff that's really mostly just offensive, and is actually a really good signal about whether or not you want to take this person's responses seriously to other questions. But that in terms of giving us additional information about gender per se, it doesn't really do it. The Williams Institute out of UCLA has come up with a series of questions that we can ask that get at kind of gender or sex at birth, gender now, has it changed, in what way? So those are questions that have been piloted numerous times and that I think are pretty good for that, and do ask that kind of question and are able to kind of get at different identities. But again, not at masculine versus feminine and how that might relate, because, as a woman or as a man, how the rest of that goes is, I think, a question that's important, because I can be a woman and be really feminine or super feminine in some contexts and not others. And that's, again, trying to kind of get at that and to tease that apart, I think is worthwhile. Because some of the stuff that we found, for example, in that political behavior paper, is that, women who place themselves in the super feminine category of the scale are actually less progressive on a number of issues than middling men. So men who place themselves not on the far pole, but place themselves closer to the middle, but still masculine, those folks are really progressive on a number of issues. And so we would lose that if we just asked where do you place yourself, or what are you, male, female, other? We wouldn't get to tease that apart. And I think that seeing that is really, really worthwhile.
Michelle Dion is, I guess this is more of a comment than a question. We did a local LGBTQISA plus community-based survey and had 21 gender identity options with a check all that apply. It was a challenge to recode, but many people did choose multiple identity. The first thing I thought was, oh my God, I'm going to have 21 dummy variables in this regression or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and that's a big question, right? So I don't know, Michelle, if you remember, how many people were in that multiple category, like once you add them all together?
I will say when she responds, but you might want, about 40%.
Really? Okay, that surprises me. Because what I was going to say was that, when we're looking to, for example, understand trans attitudes to something, whether it's politics or, healthcare or whatever, it's really, they're not present in large numbers in our regular surveys, right? And so, trying to get at that through what I've been doing with this work with Elizabeth is not really happening, right? So, but getting at people who may not see themselves at the polar opposite ends of this continuum is quite feasible. That's about 30% of the scale. We can definitely talk about this some more in the future over beer.
Michelle added that many people chose cisgendered and then also some non-conforming, but our target population was members of the community. Yeah, so there was an oversampling, probably. Right. Yeah, like if you did a probability sample, it'd be different. Right. Okay, well, it is 1 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and thank Amanda for being our presenter this week. I would like to remind everyone that this broadcast will be posted to our website shortly after the broadcast, if you'd like to share it with a colleague or watch it again later. I'd also like to invite you to join us next week, Friday, February 21st, when we will host a talk by Joe Ornstein from Washington University in St. Louis. Please see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk. Amanda, thanks a lot for being here today.
Thank you.
And I hope to see everyone next time.